Good afternoon, this is Jim Williams with the Hurricane City Tropical Update for October 5th around 3 p.m. Well, here's the current map of Hurricane City showing our activity in the Atlantic Basin. We have Hurricane Joaquin pulling away from Bermuda, heading into the shipping lanes, and should be giving some areas of the British Isles some wind and rain over the probably later in the week coming up. And then we have two areas of disturbed weather in the Atlantic. The National Hurricane Center gives these a low probability for development. In fact, none of the models are really showing much with either of these systems, probably due to wind shear. But in the Western Caribbean coming up probably next week, we could see a potential low pressure area develop and head north in the general direction of Cuba and Florida, and that would be going into the middle of the month. Problem with long-range models like the GFS, anything beyond 10 days is using a much lower resolution. Higher resolution, more data, more grids, and the models have much better information within them. So the first 7 days or so is okay with models, and then after that the resolution drops off dramatically. So that's why you can't put a lot of stock in real long-range models like that, but it is something to keep an eye on. Typical for late in October to have systems develop down in the Western Caribbean Sea and head in the general direction of Florida. In this video, I wanted to talk about a lot of the misconceptions that went on with Hurricane Joaquin during its development stages, where the National Hurricane Center said it would make landfall for about a 24-hour period, and how the models handled this system. I want to show you the European model, and this is on the Tropical Tidbits website, going back to the 28th of October. Now, this is when Hurricane Joaquin was nothing more than a tropical depression between Bermuda and the Bahamas. And you can see on this run here from the 0Z run on the 28th, the European model had a weak system right near the Outer Banks of North Carolina about to move inland. And then if we go out 12 hours beyond that, the next run had it going into North Carolina as probably maybe a strong tropical storm, maybe a weak hurricane. And then that was it. Those were the only two runs that the European model indicated the east coast of the United States would be impacted. And again, the European model does not really do well on very weak systems that have not established themselves. And reading up a lot on the European model after Hurricane Joaquin, come to find out that the model is really good at weeding out bad data in the early runs. In other words, the first 2 to 3 runs of the model, there's a lot of bad information that gets put into it, and then it has a good ability to weed out the garbage. In other words, take out the garbage and keep only the good information in the model. And from that point forward, starting on the 29th, the model nailed the track just west of Bermuda and out to sea after hitting the Bahamas. In fact, the European model and the UK Met model were the only models to really indicate that this was going to go deep into the Bahamas, real deep into the central Bahamas, before turning around and heading northeast. And that was going to allow it to linger down there a little longer than the GFS model was thinking it would linger. And that's why the European model ended up being right. It took a little longer to turn around and go back the opposite direction towards the Bermuda area, whereas the GFS model had it coming out of the Bahamas a little bit quicker and heading toward the United States. But the consensus on the social networks in hindsight was that, well, the European model had it coming into the United States all along, and that's not quite true. It was only for 2 runs, and it was when Joaquin was a very weak system. Once it got its act together, the European model basically nailed this entire track. Now let's take a look at the forecast track from the National Hurricane Center, and this was at the time of Hurricane Joaquin, as it was a Category 1 hurricane heading towards the Bahamas. And you can see that the forecast at that point was for this to make landfall right near the North Carolina, Virginia border and head into the Delmarva Peninsula. That was the only run that the National Hurricane Center had where it showed a solid line, the center of the cone of air heading toward the United States. The only other advisory they issued like that, the center of the cone was just offshore New Jersey and heading up toward New York. But all the other runs from the National Hurricane Center, yes, there was a portion of the cone that was showing a U.S. threat in the earlier days that the GFS was indicating this was going to make landfall in the United States. But the National Hurricane Center never completely bit on the sharp left-hand turn like you see here, the red model and the purple model were GFS ensembles that were taking this into southern North Carolina. The National Hurricane Center never bid on that because of the Aqua model over here, the European track, which showed it going just west of Bermuda, and that they, sure enough, the National Hurricane Center realized that and did not shift it too radical, and then they bent it back toward the right, heading out to sea eventually once the high altitude aircraft got out there and that additional data went into the models. So as the system was heading down into the Bahamas, it was moving to the southwest, and the Bahamas were getting a little bit nervous about this. The National Hurricane Center and the Bahamas government finally issued a hurricane warning for the central Bahamas. And here's what happened with the pressure. Now, it was in the northeast of the Bahamas, and you can see the pressure drop. Now, this is courtesy of the HurTrack program. And you can see we got the lowest pressure on Joaquin through its entire journey at 931 millibars. That was on October 1st around 8 p.m. Now, this is when it was moving into the Bahamas as a very powerful hurricane with winds of 130 miles per hour. And then as it left the Bahamas, the pressure went up a little bit as it was pulling away, but then it found a favorable environment north of the Bahamas and went back down to 933 millibars, and that's when the winds went up to around 155 miles an hour. Now, on the hurricane warning shows that we do at hurricanecity.tv, I was mentioning the possibility that this could get up near Category 5 if it found itself underneath the ridge of high pressure just north of the Bahamas at that time, and that's exactly what happened. Once it found it got into a little more favorable environment, became more symmetrical, and that allowed the system to tap into some of those very warm waters of the Atlantic and become almost a Category 5 hurricane before weakening as it headed towards Bermuda. Now, if we look at the winds, I put the name of the islands as they were impacted by Hurricane Joaquin. You can see here in advisory number 16A from the National Hurricane Center, the hurricane had winds of 130 miles an hour as it hit Acklands. Now, it went just north of Acklands Island, and that's when it began to change directions and head toward the north. Then it went just east of Long Island, Bahamas, and then it exited the Bahamas near San Salvador Island. In fact, the eye passed right over San Salvador Island as a 130 mile an hour hurricane. And then it started to weaken quickly here. Well, not quickly, but weakened down to 125 as it was exiting San Salvador. Then it peaked again out here when it got away from the Bahamas to near Category 5 strength. So pretty interesting stuff watching how the pressure and the winds correlated as this system made landfall in the Bahamas. And another thing I want to mention are the observations that were reported in the Bahamas. Now, I was reluctant to post these in the update videos because I questioned whether these wind readings were valid in the Bahamas. And this is from the Weather Underground from Spring Point in the Bahamas, showing a north wind of 109 miles an hour gusting to 142. Now, I emailed Dr. Jeff Masters from the Weather Underground, rather, and he informed me that these readings were not accurate and that the instruments were having all kinds of problems. In fact, this station was offline at the time of these readings, which is really what raised my speculation about whether these were valid or not. Plus, the temperature of 92 degrees made no sense. Usually, you'd like to see temperatures in the 70s and the 60s when a hurricane this powerful makes landfall, because there's a lot of cool air mixing down in with those thunderstorms and a lot of rain. It's almost like standing in the shower in a hurricane, and the water is not warm, it's cold. So I was doubting that 92 degree temperature. Sure enough, Dr. Jeff Masters cleared it up. Those were not legitimate readings from the Bahamas. And also wanted to point out that there were reports of 8 fatalities in the Bahamas. I first saw that on Wayne Neely's Facebook page, and Wayne Neely, I've had him on the shows at Hurricane City. He's written numerous hurricane books about Bahama hurricanes, and he was reporting from people he was talking to in the affected areas that there were 8 confirmed fatalities, with as many as 30 people missing. Turns out that when they got to these islands and investigated, the 8 people that were in that location they thought they were going to be had moved to a different location, so they were found alive okay. There were not any deaths in the Bahamas, and that's another thing that kind of took off on social media there for a little while. It was just why you got to be real careful when you use social media. Just go to a lot of different sources, especially official sources, to find out if there's truth to some of this stuff or not. So as the system turned around and started to head north, it passed just west of Bermuda. And now at that time, social networking again was going bananas with the National Hurricane Center. There's no way that this is going to go west of Bermuda. It's going to hit Bermuda or go east of Bermuda. The way this system is traveling, there's no way it's going to go west of Bermuda. Well, the National Hurricane Center in their forecast indicated this would pass roughly about 100 miles to the west of Bermuda, and then they had to adjust it slightly east, but there was enough indication that there may be hurricane conditions on the island, so they put up a hurricane warning. The government of Bermuda did that, but it turns out that this is the closest approach, 57 nautical miles to the west-northwest of the island of Bermuda. They did not get under the hurricane force wind field, and here is the radar from right about the closest point of approach. You can see the core of the hurricane is well to the west of the island, and it moved north. So again, social networking was wrong, and the National Hurricane Center pretty much got it right. All right, now let's do a little bit of an inventory on my city and island picks for the 2015 hurricane season. I released these on May 15th. Matagorda, Texas was my number 5 pick. That was hit by Tropical Storm Bill earlier in the season. So this makes 11 out of 13 years that at least one of my top 5 locations has been hit by a named storm. And of course, Hurricane Joaquin helped those numbers a little bit. My number 13 pick, Bermuda, and my number 15 pick, San Salvador Island, got hit directly by Hurricane Joaquin. And if this system pans out in the Western Caribbean, there's a few cities in Florida that I have in my top 5 as well. So it might end up being a good year for my city predictions. Anyway, that's it for now. Just be careful with the social networking and the stories and the people that are trying to relive the way things happen. To clear things up again, the European model was only wrong on 1 or 2 runs at the very beginning. 99% of the time the model was dead on the track. Number 2, the National Hurricane Center track taking it in the United States was only for about a day or so. It was not that long that the center of the cone was aiming at the United States. National Hurricane Center did a good job on figuring out the difference between the GFS and the Euro, and they were siding on caution following the GFS, but they were also not going sharply to the left because of the Euro. Number 3, the deaths and the wind field information that was passed around on the social networks was also a little bit off. So what I would suggest, when a hurricane is hitting, go to official sources of information, and always come to the Hurricane City message board, Kane Talk, or go to Hurricane City and watch our shows, especially hurricanecity.tv. When there's hurricane warnings up, you get all kinds of information on the models. We dissect everything. And yes, I was leaning Euro the entire time on this Hurricane Joaquin track. I thought for maybe a day there that it might be a U.S. threat, but I was pretty much waiting for the Euro to come around, which it never did. And the Euro ended up winning the battle on the models on this system. The rest of them were not very good. Anyway, that's it for now. Follow us on Twitter at Hurricane City. I'll have another update if we have development in the Western Caribbean. Thank you for watching.